With a lot of growing interest in hunting with stone points, I figured I'd like to do a video about talking about what to expect after the shot when shooting an animal with a stone point. Believe it or not, there are some differences in shooting an animal with a steel point versus the stone point as far as blood trail goes and everything. And I kind of wanted to cover some of that because it might discourage some people that are on a blood trail thinking that perhaps they didn't make a good shot when in fact they actually may have. So by discussing this, hopefully we'll save you a little bit of aggravation or that disappointment of thinking that you've lost an animal when in reality it could only be another 20, 30, 40 yards ahead. To kind of understand this, let's talk about the stone points in general. Now I'm going to do a whole nother video on the sharpness of stone points and how sharp they need to be and what to expect. But right now we're just going to assume for a very sharp stone point, which is what you really need to have when you hunt. You don't want to have a dull point at all. So everything that I'm talking about is with a really, really super sharp stone point. A bifaced point, which is one that's napped on both sides, not talking about just a flake that's been knocked off that's fairly arrowhead shaped and sharp, but an actual bifaced point requires some degree of serrations to be truly sharp. You can't nap a smooth edge and expect it to be exceptionally sharp and to cut really well. And that being said, when you shoot through an animal's skin with a serrated point, it tends to actually heal a little bit faster. And I'm not saying that it won't kill the animal as fast, but that entry and exit wound, the skin will actually start to heal itself surprisingly fast, and it'll keep it from bleeding. Before I really knew what I was talking about, before I'd ever killed a deer or anything, I used to get on the internet and being kind of a dumb kid used to say, that all that rough cut of a stone point, that's gonna make them bleed way worse because it won't heal up as fast, and the steel points with that razor surgical cut, that's it's gonna just fold right back together and it's gonna stop bleeding, where stone's gonna be like this, in the cut, and it's gonna bleed crazy. And it's completely opposite. I regret ever saying something that was so uneducated at the time. When you take a cut with a serrated point and it's leaving a ragged edge, all them little pieces will come back together. Even if they're not perfect, they'll come back together somewhere, and they start to heal up super, super fast. And for whatever reason, when you get one of those surgical cuts with a steel point, and you think that they would come together like this, it's actually hard to get everything to stick like this. As opposed to this, it's easy to get it and grab. Where this, it doesn't. So those surgical cut entry and exit wounds that are just little slits that you think would heal up faster, they actually bleed way worse than a ragged cut entry wound. And now as far as, when the point gets inside the animal, those serrations are extremely devastating to organs and stuff, and I'll talk about that again in the next video with talking about the sharpness of the stone points. So it has nothing to do with how fast it will kill the animal. In fact, I've killed animals faster with stone points in some situations than I have with steel points, simply because of the damage that it does do internally if you've got a good sharp stone point. But they will tend to bleed a little bit less. Now, when you shoot a deer, the ones that I've shot, and this is all going from my experience, the things that I've experienced out in the woods with the animals that I've killed, if you shoot a deer with a steel point and you get a total pass through, the arrow's laying on the ground on the other side and it runs off, it's leaking good out both sides, and you can typically get good blood trail. A lot of times guys nowadays want to get the arrow completely through, so they get the arrow out of the way and more blood can spill out. And it's actually a little bit opposite with the stone pointed arrow. I mean, I like to get out both sides. I already talked about that in another video, that I like to have an entry and an exit. I want two holes in the animal. I don't want one, because this guarantees that I've destroyed all the organs between point A and point B, each side of the animal. So I want to get it all the way through. But if possible, which, there's no way to ever guarantee you're going to get the arrow to stay. There's a lot of variables to that. But I actually like it if the arrow stays in the animal, because as it's running through the woods, that arrow's banging on every tree and stick that it hits, and it's constantly jarring on that wound, and it's opening it up again and not letting it heal, and it's bleeding out. When you shoot the arrow completely through, the healing process actually starts. You may get really good blood, but then it'll quit. And something that I've noticed, and this is what really prompted this video, one of the things that I've really noticed is if the animal is carrying the arrow with it, it's bleeding good. There's typically a pretty decent amount of blood to follow. Now, you're not, again, and it varies. Now, I've had the best blood trail of my life was a deer shot with a stone point, and then the worst blood trail of my life was one shot with a stone point. There's just a lot of variables. It depends where you hit, you know, if the arrow stays in and whatnot. So there's no way to just say that steel always bleeds better than stone, or stone always bleeds better than steel, and that's not the way it works. But typically steel points, you get a pretty consistent blood trail compared to stone, which has again a lot of variables that will determine how much the animal bleeds or not. But there's been times where I've shot an animal and it's run off with the arrow, I can see it, and I get on the trail and there's a lot of blood to be found, and it's an easy trail and it's walking, and then all of a sudden it'll go into someplace thick and I can't see it or whatever, and it'll break the arrow off, and I'll find the pieces of the arrow. So whether it keeps half the arrow inside of it, or it breaks both ends off and they both fall out, or whatever. Typically, I found that once I find those pieces of arrow, I know it's going to get more difficult here real soon, because it's usually about 10 yards after they lose that arrow. And I mean, this is happening super fast because they're running. So it's a matter of they're losing the arrow, and within a few strides, that hole has already started to close. And I'm not saying they stop bleeding, but you're going to notice a significant decrease in blood that's on the ground. And usually between 10 to 15, 20 yards, you may actually go to where there is no more blood on the ground. And I've had that where I've shot an animal and only hit one lung. I shot a doe a few years back that I came in at an angle. She was quartering away, and I actually missed the first lung. I shot a little too far back and angled down and shot the second lung, and she carried the arrow a long way. And as soon as she dropped the arrow, 10 yards later, the blood was done. There was not a drop of blood to be found, and I searched for hours that night, and not being really sure if I hit, I went home, and I came back the next day, and again, there was no blood to follow, and I just followed the trail that she was on, and would see tracks every now and running tracks, and I knew that I was on the right path, and that was the important part. And I got up maybe another 50 yards or so, and there was one tiny drop of blood on a leaf in like a little funnel between some bushes where the trail went, and I knew that that's where she went, and there was one little drop of blood. And I continued on the trail, and I found her laying dead there shortly after. With a one long hit, she died in under 200 yards on the run. So I mean, that's still a pretty good success rate, but obviously every chance I get, I want to double on them. And another thing I kind of want to mention with that, just because I like to mention it so you can know what to expect, and I will mention it again, I'm sure, in another video, is if I double lung one with a stone point, I've never had one go over about 60 yards tops. In fact, most of the deer that I shoot double lung, I watch them fall. And there's no blood trailing necessary, but a lot of times I'll follow the blood just because I want to see what it did. But I do hear stories of people that say, well, I shot one with a stone point and I got both lungs and it ran 200 yards, which either one of two things has happened. Either you actually didn't get both lungs and one didn't deflate and you only got one lung, or because people just think, oh, just because you hit it on the lung you got enough penetration, and that's not the case. Sometimes they go and puncture one lung and it doesn't hurt the other one. Or your stone point was not sharp at all and it actually didn't cut and destroy lung tissue. All it did was puncture a hole in it, and then that arrow stays in, and that lung tissue will actually start to heal up a little bit around that arrow, and obviously they're going to die, but it takes longer because it's not completely deflating the lungs. I think that happens more often than not when people shoot dull points. I mean, that's the same reason that we don't go into the woods and shoot a deer with a field point, because it takes so much longer for it to kill you. You need that hemorrhage. You need to destroy organs, and that's what a really sharp stone point does. So you don't need to just comment on the video that, well, I shot one with a stone point and it ran 200 yards and I hit a double lung. You know, there is a reason for that. And again, I'm using my equipment that I use as a control and saying that I know my points are really sharp. When I rub them on the back of my hand, I can cut myself. And when I run that through lungs, it destroys it. And so again, anytime that I've ever shot one through the lungs, I've watched it fall or heard it fall, or it's fallen just out of sight and in grass or something where I can't hear it. I've never lost one, and I've never had one go over 60 yards with a perfect double lung shot with a stone point. It never happened to me. It may happen to somebody, but not to me. But what has happened to me a couple times, even with a perfect double lung shot, and here's another example, and I had this happen with a pig, and it happened with a deer last year. At that point of the darkness coming in where you can't really see the arrow in flight, you can't see where it hit, but you can see the deer, you can see the spot you want to shoot at, and it's just within that, about that 10 or 15 minute range, right before about you're getting ready to get up and leave. And a smaller doe came in and stopped kind of right in front of me to kind of look around or whatever, and I, about 8 yards away, really good, comfortable shot I shot, and I heard it hit and the deer run off, and I thought, okay, well, I'm pretty sure I made a good hit. I mean, I could see where I was looking, you just couldn't see the arrow with the dark turkey fletchings and everything like that, that it just disappeared, you can't see them. So she runs off, and I give her time, like you would in, you know, any archery situation. You know, we kind of like to give them half an hour just to be safe. Well, she runs off, and I can hear her running, and then it kind of gets quiet, and I couldn't hear her crash, but I didn't hear her make any circles running, and it's pretty thick in the area that I was hunting. So I give her time, and I come back, and at this point it's really dark, and I get on blood immediately. I mean, where I shot, it blew blood out the other side, you know, and lung tissue on the ground and stuff, because those points just grab it and tear it up. And so she takes off running, and I'm following tracks and blood on both sides. So that tells me that I've got penetration through completely. You know, I got blood on both sides of the trail. The arrow's not there, so she's still carrying it. So this is good. You know, best case scenario in my opinion. Arrow's still in her. She's bleeding good. She's running. At this point, I'm pretty darn sure that I've got a double lung, but I don't know for sure. I may only have one for all I know. But the blood looks good, so I'm following it. And I get maybe 30 yards, maybe 25, 30 yards, give or take. She kind of run a little bit of a circle, and I find the arrow, both pieces of the arrow. She broke it inside. I guess it must have fell out both sides. Just about the same. They were within steps of each other. So I find the arrow, and at that point I go, okay, well, let's hope she's laying up here pretty close, but I didn't see her fall and didn't hear her fall, so I had a little bit of suspicion that, you know, she may have gone further. Maybe I didn't hit both lungs, I'm not sure. So I go up about 10 more yards and the blood just quits. And I'm looking everywhere trying to figure out where she went. And of course I don't solely track by blood. I look for anything that's disturbed, pushed up leaves, broken twigs, tracks. Even a lot of times you'll find like snot from their nose where they're running and it'll drip out, and you'll just see something wet. And these are things that, you know, obviously are out of place in a wild situation. So I start following these things, and I just kind of lose her, and I get to a real thick spot, and I haven't had blood for about 20 yards or so. And I'm not the kind of guy that likes to push, because if I don't know for sure that that deer went down, a lot of times with stone I shoot one, or with anything, with these self bows, they're so quiet. A lot of times I shoot the deer, don't know they're hit, and I've had them actually run 10 or 20 yards, stop and look around, like, what was that? And then all of a sudden they stumble and they fall down, they don't even know they're hit. Because the bow is just not as alarming as like a loud recurve or a compound or something. I think the adrenaline that's rushing through them doesn't really let them know that they're even hurt. But so in that situation that I've seen that happen, I was kind of envisioning this little doe running and hitting the thick stuff and stopping, and then thinking something, I don't feel real good, and then just laying down. Because even if you make kind of a bad shot, sometimes they won't run, but 50 yards, and they'll just lay right down, and you'll find them there the next morning. So we don't really have a whole lot of coyotes in the area that I was hunting at the time. So I thought it was plenty cool out. I'll just go ahead and go home. It's getting late, and I'll just come in here first thing in the morning and look. So I didn't push. I was just trying to be extra safe. But the blood had quit, and that's what made me question my shot more than anything. So I would go home. I get up in the morning, and I come out, and I get on the blood again, and I think, well, maybe she turned. At night you're thinking all these different things. Maybe she turned. I got off the trail. Who knows? So I get back on the blood, and the same thing. I get right to where the arrow was shortly after the blood stops, and there's no more sign to be found, no more blood sign. Of course, I can still find tracks, every so often. And I'm following, just going, there's no blood, and I'm thinking, this is just bad news. But in my head, I know that these stone points do this. When the arrow comes out, they stop bleeding. So I get up right to that thick spot where I think, I'm afraid that she got in here and laid down. And I walked into it, and of course, at dark, you shine a light, and you just can't see that good, especially through limbs and everything. And now daylight, I walk right in there, and just 10 yards there she is laying dead, died on the run. She is upside down, up against a tree. She died. It was a perfect double lung shot. In fact, I'll show you, I think I got a picture I'll upload here real quick for you. So anyway, it was a perfect double lung shot, and she didn't go but maybe 50 yards, I think, from where I shot her. But it was amazing how when that arrow came out, you start losing that blood. It starts to dry up quick, and it starts to heal over. And it was amazing, sitting there, that she should have had a lot of blood running down her, and you just really don't get that with the stone points. And the same thing I had happen with a hog that I shot. Made a perfect double lung on it, angled forward, got both lungs, and I followed great blood for 20-25 yards. The arrow came out, and the blood stopped within 10 yards. There was no blood. I stand up into palmettos to look ahead, and 15 yards later, there's the hog laying dead. There was no blood in between where the arrow came out, and very little on the pig itself. In fact, I'll show you another picture of the wound on this one, and you can just see there's just not a lot of blood to be found on it. But here's the picture of that one. So I end up taking it back to camp, and the other people see the pig, and they're just like, I can't believe that there's no blood on this thing. And it says, well, that's just sometimes what happens with stone points, and it's not that it doesn't kill them as fast. I mean, it killed her just as fast and just as dead as a steel point did, but it doesn't leave that trail. So if you're going to hunt with stone, I recommend kind of upping your tracking game. And if the blood runs out, and you find the arrow and the blood runs out, don't get discouraged and go home. There's people that'll do that, say, well, it quit bleeding, I must not have killed it, and they'll turn around and leave. I've seen people do that with metal points. They'll shoot something, and the blood will run out, and they'll say, well, I guess I didn't get that one, and they'll pack up and go home, and 20 yards later, there it is laying dead. Sometimes you have to push forward, and I know a lot of people, and myself included, don't like to move off last blood. If you find that last blood, you like to find the next one and move from there. Well, what happens is when it starts drying up, the next drop of blood might be 10 yards down the trail, and you got to go look for it. And then it's even harder to find because you don't know where it's going to be. And when you're looking at night, too, it's amazing how you'll be on a trail and you'll feel like you've been on it for an hour, and you might only been on it for 20 minutes. You don't even know. And you'll think, man, I've gone 300 yards, and you turn back and look, and you're blind, or your tree stand is, 30 yards away. That you've only gone 15 or so yards because you're following small drops of blood, and you're looking for the next one. So people think that they've traveled this great big distance and thought, well, if it's made it this far, then it must be fine. I didn't kill it, and it's gonna, and I'm not gonna find it dead. And then as soon as the blood runs out, then they start thinking, oh, it's healed up and it's gone and it's fine. And in reality, that deer is dead another 20 yards ahead. So basically, you're going to shoot stone points. Don't give up. Always follow up on the blood trail, and expect that if the arrow goes all the way through or breaks and falls out while the deer are running, that you're going to see less blood. So when you're following the trail and you pick up that arrow, you found it on the ground, just say, okay, the tracking's going to get more difficult from here on out. But that doesn't mean you didn't make a perfect hit. Even a double lung hit with a good stone point, it's going to kill them fast, but it just may not bleed that much.